What the f? Avengers Infinity War broke many people's hearts when Spider-Man at the very end uttered,
I don't feel so good.
so it's almost poetic that Spider-Man arrives in Marvel's Avengers almost 3.5 years later, and after playing it, it doesn't feel so good. So, you have a copy of Marvel's Avengers. You probably even got it for Black Friday at a whopping $15. I actually saw somewhere that it's even cheaper sometimes for $10. And it's obviously to kind of harbor on the occasion that Spider-Man has finally arrived to Marvel's Avengers after a very long and lengthy promise from Square Enix and Eidos Montreal, where they promised the character for PlayStation players ever since the game came out. I mean, literally, Marvel's Avengers came out in September of 2020, and ever since then, it was not only a marketing standpoint for the game, but also a pre-order incentive to be like, hey, if you get the game on PlayStation, you get Spider-Man. There was always a sticker on the cellophane that is now long since gone, but there would be a sticker saying, hey, Spider-Man is coming. It's coming. Bet your ass it's coming. Where is he? Yeah, a lot of us were really starting to kind of itch and get very, very worried, considering that a long time has passed, and with the actual critical reception that Marvel's Avengers received, which many of you already probably know what that reception was. It was very middle of the road, with people praising the single-player campaign for its action heroics and set pieces, while at the same time heavily criticizing pretty much anything that has to do with the games as a service mechanics inside of this game that's trying to force feed to you. So my standpoint pretty much kind of aligns with all those others. So if you want to know exactly how I feel about Marvel's Avengers, you can pretty much check out any other review out there, and I pretty much almost agree from point to point. Outside of that, however, we had a really large chunk of time passing with the expansions for Wakanda and Black Panther, as well as Hawkeye and Kate Bishop. But where's my wall crawler? Where's he at? And for a second there, I legitimately thought that they were going to cancel, until finally they started to kind of spark up the flame of discussion, saying it's coming by the end of 2021. And they also announced that there were not going to be any story missions. But it's a free add-on for PlayStation users, which I have Marvel's Avengers 4, so I figured, you know what, let's reserve judgment, very formal and critical judgment, until November 30th. November 30th came and went. It's finally here. Spider-Man has arrived. Where is he? I spent a good 10-15 minutes running my dumbass around as Iron Man, trying to find Spidey. Kept saying, he's in the command center, he's in the command deck, where is he at? Trying to track him down to get started on his heroic event. Bruh, I legitimately couldn't figure it out up until I realized that there's what the game calls suspicious web on one of the command deck windows. A web that just so fluently blends into the background, so it was very easy for me to miss. Finally, interacting with said web will then trigger the heroic event for Spider-Man. And I will admit, this is actually a worthwhile introduction, because though it does start to show the budgetary or the constraints that the developers were dealt with as far as this being an exclusive, you can see that right away, because it starts off with a 2D comic book style kind of animatic. So you have still images then being animated to look like they're kind of moving about, showing how Spidey came to know the Avengers, tracking down the helicarrier and getting involved with the events of AIM taking over the city and doing their chaos. However, the actual presentation and just the actual compelling charm of this animatic kind of roped me in a little bit, especially since now Sean Chiplock is actually the voice actor behind Spider-Man, taking over from, quite frankly, various other iterations, and he holds his own. He genuinely does feel like Spider-Man. In fact, at times, he does kind of sound a little bit like Yuri Lowenthal did in Insomniac Spider-Man. However, different enough to kind of hone in on his own version for Marvel's Avengers, and he carries it. He really did make me feel like the character was there. and that was legitimately Peter Parker, or at least a Peter Parker, as Spider-Man interacting with the Avengers. So he never created some kind of disconnection or, you know, anything too much of a negative impact on me feeling like, yes, this is actually Spider-Man hanging out with the Avengers and getting involved with them. And that then led to a in-game cinematic of Spidey actually getting into the helicarrier, interacting with some of the Avengers, not necessarily all of them, but I actually felt a good dynamic between all of them, especially between him and Kamala Khan, who are about the same age group, and also within the same kind of perspective of being kind of new, relatively new at least, to being a superhero, because this version of Spider-Man actually happens after the Avengers have already kind of been on the scene. He happens between the events of A-Day and during the prequel, or rather the prologue of the original game, and then where we're at here. So I thought that that was actually an interesting take on the character, but it also still felt very familiar to not kind of alienate old school fans like myself. Getting past this intro then leads you into the tutorial to kind of give you a breakdown of how Spidey is actually going to feel and fight in Marvel's Avengers. Now, if you have already gotten a sense of how Avengers plays out, regardless of which hero you play as, you kind of have a gist of how the combat works. You're primarily mashing either square or triangle or X and Y, depending on your console of choice, to then kind of dish out your light and heavy attacks, while at the same time mixing in heroics from the bumpers that you have on your controller, as well as being able to kind of trigger something called instinct, or I can't remember what it's called, but this added feature to your character to either hyper realize your attacks or to kind of create some kind of effect for you and the surrounding characters around you, depending on which Avenger you're playing as, by pressing one of the triggers. And so these kind of mechanics, these basic overall mappings of the controller still kind of apply to Spidey, but the best way I can kind of summarize is that this is kind of like the Wish.com version of gameplay from the Insomniac Spidey, where it's very, very similar to that of Insomniac's in terms of how he actually fights, how he maneuvers, how he kind of jumps around and deals with acrobatics, and kind of still feels familiar Spider-Man, while at the same time being different enough to know that it wasn't Insomniac who developed this. This very much translates to the combat, where he feels like he's realistically acrobatic, because in Insomniac Spider-Man you can definitely see how they take liberties with physics and his physiology, as far as how he's able to kind of leap and bound in ways that you know are very superhero-like. Whereas here, it does legitimately feel like it's a gymnast, like they got a gymnast to motion capture the entirety of his movements, while never really exaggerating any of them and going in there and kind of tweaking things to make them look very superhero-like or very abnormally like. He actually does look like someone dishing out punches and kicks, using different kinds of acrobatics, and even stuff that are real-life, either dance moves or fighting styles, whether it be jiu-jitsu, capoeira, things like that. You can kind of get influences of that through his fighting style. And speaking of that Insomniac game, I actually have a video coming up tackling the Game of the Year edition that comes with the DLC that I've never ever talked about. So if you want to stay tuned for that video, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss it. But once we get to the actual web-based attacks is where things start to go down the, well, I guess you could say the bargain bin, because something just feels kind of missing from his web attacks that he utilizes with his ranged aiming down sights movements, like that are mapped to the triggers, where you use L2, in my case playing on PlayStation, L2 to aim down sights, and then R2 to then shoot your web attacks, as well as using the triangle to sometimes kind of zip to enemies using your web strands. And there's just something less zippy about this, especially because either you don't feel the weight behind the web or the yank behind the web, so to speak, or some of the sound effects just sound kind of underwhelming whenever he dishes out those web balls or web-based attacks. It just sounds like he's going quick like that, and something just doesn't necessarily click like even other past games have done before, whether it be with Insomniac or even any of the Beanox games back in the mid to late 2000s. There were something about those web attacks that just felt very cool to execute, and that's just simply not the case here. Everything felt kind of weak in terms of the webbing that Spider-Man has to do. I don't know if maybe it was underdeveloped or undercooked as far as it was released. And that also goes for the web swinging. Overall, it doesn't feel too bad, especially since every character has to have some kind of traversal mechanic to make things kind of go a little bit quicker, especially when you go into those open areas, those open canyons or lab environments that you need to be able to jump and leap and do things like that. And sometimes his web swinging would feel good for the most part, that you can kind of get a sense of the rhythm and again feel like it would in Insomniac, except at times he does have a bit of a slowdown when he shoots out a different web, so it kind of breaks up the pacing and breaks up the momentum the same way that I almost broke my case just then. And here we are almost 20 years later, and we're still dealing with the problem of what it is that Spidey's even attaching himself to when he's traversing certain environments that you know damn well there's no buildings for him to be web slinging from, so he's literally zipping into nothing, reminding me an awful lot of the 2002 Spider-Man movie game. And if you thought that was nonsensical enough, wait till you get to the wall crawling. There's times where it feels like he's more so Spider-Man from Spider-Man 2, where he's starting to lose his powers, as opposed to Spider-Man from either the Avengers movies or any other property, take your pick, because sometimes it feels kind of wonky, it feels like he's not attaching right, he just kind of bounces off the wall, and then other times the game just breaks its own logic to where you would expect him to be able to crawl up a certain mountainside, and yet invisible wall, because the other characters can do so, so you mustn't either, regardless of you being Spider-Man. Much like the other Avengers, he also has his own set of heroic abilities mapped to the different bumpers, whether you press L1 or R1 independently, or both of them together, you have different power attacks. And one of them is the drone, kind of extrapolated a little bit from Marvel's or Insomniac's game, where he has the spider drone going around shooting different enemies while you kind of dish out the melee attacks. The others are also, once again, web-based attacks. However, these do in fact kind of harbor that punch that I was, kind of desiring from his basic web attacks, where he either throws a web bomb that then shoots out and either webs up enemies or attaches them to the wall so that then you can dish out damage and knock them out. And that's very, very handy. You then also have the major power player of a heroic, which is to press L1 and R1 together, thus dishing out a web bomb that is much bigger than the original, with both strands being webbed up like this, him kind of flinging it like a wrecking ball. He even calls it a web wrecking ball, and he just dishes out major damage, and it's a very awesome move to pull off. It's just a shame that you're going to be pulling it off very, very scarcely, because I don't know if it's just me, but these heroics take much longer to charge back up after use versus other Avengers. I remember playing as all the other Avengers, whether it be through the single player campaign or through random operations, where the heroics will load up a whole lot quicker, and yet Spidey takes his sweet time, despite already being, at least my Spidey, being much more leveled up than hell, even Black Widow or even my Hawkeye. And I know that this could be due to having to upgrade that skill tree, just like with the other Avengers. Spidey has his own skill tree to level up and earn skill points to then use in that skill tree to level up some of these moves, break down the heroic cooldowns, be able to dish out better attacks, being able to dodge perfectly and then do some executions upon a perfect dodge. So that similar kind of architecture that you have had in your other Avengers are also here with Spidey, but doing so means that you're gonna have to level him up and grind him out, which unfortunately is the only way that you can progress in Peter's story, is to pull out that grind. That one thing that a lot of us single player users or single player people that were trying to get through the campaign on Marvel's Avengers were trying to avoid, regardless of how badly the game was trying to again shove it down our throats. You are not escaping it if you were looking forward to Spider-Man being in Avengers, because that's the only real way to get any kind of story in this Spider-Man DLC, which is already the biggest problem with the game. One that I already saw coming from a mile away. I just wasn't expecting it to be this bad. And as you can tell, I don't enjoy this aspect about the Spider-Man's inclusion in Marvel's Avengers with all the grindiness. But if you guys are enjoying this video, make sure to hit the thumbs up button down below. It really helps out with the algorithm and it helps out the channel a lot. See what I did there? Okay, anyways, moving on. Essentially, everything that was needed to complete heroic events for the other Avengers past the opening bits that had a little bit of a story or some kind of narrative cohesion, then moves on to the more grindy stuff that I was trying to avoid this entire time. Defeat certain amount of enemies, defeat enemies using a certain amount of damage or specific moves that need to be pulled off, some of which are tailored to those heroic abilities that take forever to charge up, inquiring me to have to either just kind of run around waiting for my other Avengers to take out a certain amount of enemies while my heroics charge back up, because what's the point of me going through these enemies and completing the mission if I know that I have to hit a certain amount of enemies killed using my specific heroic ability. At that point, I might as well exit out of the mission and then jump back in, which eventually I did end up having to do. I also ended up having to look up some of this terminology that I was again trying to avoid as I was just trying to play the main campaign earlier this month to get ready for Spider-Man. I wasn't trying to trouble myself with knowing what a threat sector is versus a drop zone versus a war zone versus an operation, all these different terms, and then also realizing what kind of currency I need to get and all that stuff. I wasn't trying to bother with it. I was just trying to get to the main campaign. So now Spider-Man is actually forcing me to have to go on to the Avengers subreddit or simply go into Google and type in what is a war zone, what is a threat sector, because up until this point I legitimately didn't know exactly the difference amongst the UI in this game, and because of that I needed to take up some of my valuable time in trying to look up these terms to then realize how to progress more so in Peter's story, because ultimately the objectives in order to do so is to complete a certain amount of threat sectors, a certain amount of drop zones, and they try to add little blurbs in the corner to say what actually Peter's up to as far as his narrative, but I mean, how am I supposed to feel anything with this when all I'm really doing is just doing the same operations that I've been doing as the other Avengers in the multiplayer slash end game side of this entire game? The only real change is that you're playing as Spider-Man, nothing else. And in doing all this, you are then given access to audio logs. That's how you get your story. Amongst going into the codex and specifically selecting the folder that is labeled Spidey versus AIM or Spider-Man against AIM, something like that, then gives you access to the 14 audio files that pretty much explains Spider-Man's presence in the Avengers and him taking on AIM, getting introduced to the Avengers and trying to form a bond with them. And admittedly, the actual quality and talent behind the voice acting when you play these audio files is pretty good. There's some good rapport between Spidey and the rest of the Avengers. You kind of sense a chemistry. You even have the inclusion of Liz Allen in there, amongst other little details hearkening to some of the mythology and some of the stuff that's going on in the background in Peter's life in this corner of the universe. But outside of that, you're not really getting much else. Sure, there is another one of those hero cards or hero passes, whatever you want to call them, where you as progress get more armor, more loot, more incentives for the looting and grinding aspect of the game, as well as costumes like the other Avengers. And admittedly, some are kind of cool looking. My favorite is some of the ones that include that long leather trench coat or the spider armor one, or any kind of costume that combines my favorite clash of colors, which is of course like either black or red, or like a dark maroon hot rod red with a gray, something like that. Those obviously are costumes that are very biased towards. But outside of any of that, some of the other costumes are also not exactly anything to write home about, and because of that, you're ultimately led with the end goal to either finish Spidey's quote-unquote campaign or get the heroic suit that you saw in that initial teaser trailer, which you don't even have at the beginning. And this was all just bound to happen. It came as to no shock. I was just hanging on to the very thin web thread of hope that maybe they would do more of what we were kind of introduced with at the beginning, with that brief cutscene of him interacting with the Avengers, having some good chemistry, at least, trying to contextualize his inclusion in here. But ultimately, it really did feel like a corporate move to just add Spider-Man. And what a timely one it was, considering that we're only a couple of weeks away from the release of Spider-Man No Way Home. So this was most definitely a marketing ploy. And I knew that something was amiss when even the the developers during an interview said, why should we even bother trying to give it the same treatment that we did with our other expansions when we know that only half of our already dwindling player base is going to be able to play it, considering that it's a PlayStation exclusive per Sony's demands? Why even bother? So therefore, we're led to what is ultimately a lackluster inclusion of Spidey in Marvel's Avengers. And if you're looking for a much more definitive Spider-Man experience, just go play Insomniac's game instead. In fact, right now, because of the holiday season, you could probably find the Game of the Year edition for like 20, 15 bucks. I even saw it for like about 10 bucks in some places. And I'm probably going to be doing a video coming up very, very soon, tackling the Game of the Year edition and finally talking about the DLC, which I've never done, and also kind of telling you guys whether or not that's worth your money or whether it's worth your time come this holiday season should you end up receiving it in your stocking. So if you guys are looking forward to watching that video, click the button down below to subscribe and turn on notifications so that you stay tuned for that coming up very soon. Until next time, guys, stay humble and peace out. Yeah, I'm done with this.